Hey everybody, this is a brief tutorial on instructional accommodations for students with disabilities, and the focus of this one is settings. I have several other videos on instructional accommodations. I have the basics, presentation, response, and scheduling as well, so make sure that you check those out. I'm DJ Nicholson. I'm an instructional coach and consultant, and I support parents and educators when they work with students with disabilities. So let's go ahead and jump right into this. So if you've heard this before in some of my other videos, you can go and just zip forward to some of the barriers that we look at for accommodation, the setting type, but this is just a brief overview of accommodations in general. So accommodations are changes that are made in how a child is accessing information in the classroom and how they're demonstrating the knowledge of what they're learning. And so that's a really big shift for parents and for teachers, is understanding that, we're going to allow children to complete the assignments just like we would other students, but we're going to allow some adjustments to be made for timing, for scheduling, setting, presentation, and response. So while we're not changing the content or the instructional level or the expectation that they're to perform at grade level, we are going to make some shifts in how the child is accessing information and demonstrating their learning. So accommodations ultimately provide equity in how a child is accessing the general education curriculum, because that is the most important thing. At the end of the day, we want children to be learning. We want them to be able to process and really internalize and generalize what they're learning. And so we have accommodations, and accommodations for learning kind of level out that playing field and make sure that learning is accessible. So how do we determine accommodations? Accommodations are never someone's personal opinion. They're always determined based on the present levels of a child's performance. We want to look at barriers to accessing the content within the classroom or whatever learning environment there is. As a side note, the student is never the barrier. The disability is never the barrier. And so as an IEP team, we have to take into consideration, what is it in the academic environment that is being a barrier or inhibiting the child from learning and engaging in content. We want to look at the levels of independence. And then once we have accommodations established, we want to evaluate how effective they are. Is this an accommodation that the child is using in class? Is this something that is really benefiting them when it comes to accessing and being engaged in their learning? And then once we have accommodations determined, the IEP is a very flexible document. So we want to remember that accommodations can be adjusted and they can be changed. So whenever the IEP team looks at that, data is collected, the team is going to reconvene, and then the IEP will be amended, and the accommodations are adjusted or changed depending on what the data shows, how the student is performing. It's possible that after some time, accommodations are no longer needed. So that would be an accommodation that could be maybe deleted, and then something else that would be more supportive could be added in. The most important piece when we provide accommodations to children on their IEP is teaching them how to use their accommodation. When we teach children how to use their accommodations, we build independence, we build confidence, and we eliminate the need for that child to have an adult attached to them throughout the day. That I've seen that a lot in schools, and that really does lead to, that kind of learned helplessness and that enabling behavior that we certainly don't want. We want to support children in being as independent, as confident as possible. And so we do that through explicit and systematic instruction. And so what that means is that there's a teacher that is modeling how to use the accommodation. They are then supporting and guiding the child in using the accommodation. And then they're releasing the child to use the accommodation on their own with some support, so that that teacher can provide some constructive feedback, some corrective feedback, so the child can really understand how to use the accommodation, but then also understand why they're able to use that. And so it's really important. We have to teach kids how to use their accommodations. And of course, the older kids get, I think it gets easier to teach them, and maybe we can teach them a little bit more quickly. So for the purpose of this tutorial, we are looking at setting type accommodations. And when we make accommodations for setting, we are making a change in the environment or a change in the way the environment is structured. So if you've heard me talk about, flexible seating, flexible classrooms, that is all part of what this might look like. And so for the purpose of talking about settings, we're just going to take a look at 3 barriers. Remember, the barriers are the educational barriers, the environmental barriers, not the child and not the child's disability. So as we go through these 3, remember, these are just 3 examples of barriers when it comes to setting and making accommodations to a setting. There are multiple different opportunities. And if you need to have, more discussion with me about that, I'm happy to do that, happy to jump on a call and we can go over some of these or go over some other options. So the first barrier that we're going to take a look at is the barrier of staying focused and being able to maintain attention. And so for a lot of kids, this really can be a struggle, which is why I chose this one. This is one of the top 3. So of course, we want children to be able to be focused and maintain their attention without having to give that repeated direction over and over again. So we have some children that might benefit from noise reducing headphones or simply sitting in a different location in the classroom. And this is where that flexible seating comes into play. Quite often we expect children to sit at a desk or sit at a table with their peers, but maybe that's not the best place for them to be focused and maintain attention. Maybe it's a matter of sitting at the front of the classroom on the floor. Maybe it's sitting closer to a teacher or sitting closer to a peer that is supportive, but that's not going to be distracting. So remember to be thinking flexibly when we're looking at, sitting in a different location. Not every child performs and is engaged the most when they're sitting in a traditional chair, or a traditional table, or a traditional desk. We can also look at reducing clutter in the child's workspace. So we have a lot of kids that can't have anything on their desktops because they're too fidgety. So to have, crayons or a pencil sharpener, anything like that needs to be put away. And so that way we're reducing the clutter, we're reducing that visual stimuli, and we're just having the tools, educational tools that they need on their tabletop. And then another barrier or another suggestion to the barrier is to create smaller group opportunities in which to work. Sometimes, it's hard for a child to be engaged the most effectively in a whole group setting. So some kids, instead of working in a group of 20 or 22 students, maybe needs an opportunity to work in a smaller group. And depending on the age of the child, I think by the time kiddos get to high school, they can work in a small group with maybe not as much adult supervision. So that's something to consider. We also have, specially designed instruction when, the special educator comes in and she pulls that small group in order to dig a little bit deeper into some of those, targeted deficit areas for instruction. So that's our first barrier. Eliminating the inability to focus and the inability to maintain attention. So these 4 are just some suggestions. So here's some visuals: noise reducing headphones, smaller group. Smaller group, when I say that, I usually mean, 5 or 6 students or less. And then of course, the favorite, the desk with no clutter, which I wish I could say I have that right now, but I do not. All right, the next barrier is difficulty seeing the text and difficulty seeing illustrations. So this also goes back to that preferential seating. Preferential seating does not mean that a child is sitting right next to the teacher. Sometimes they just need to be closer to the board or to the whiteboard or to any display that the teacher might have. That also might mean that they need to be seated next to a peer for support if they need a peer to kind of point to where they're supposed to be in the text or point to an illustration. Another suggestion for removing the barrier is to change their seat in the classroom. So maybe move them away from the windows where there's distractions or there's a glare on the board. And then, switching up the lighting in the classroom. A lot of classrooms, it's very bright in there. So, kudos to teachers for bringing in lamps and other things that they can use to kind of dim that lighting and make it easier to access some of the text and reading passages and illustrations for kids. So here's just some examples. The illustration on the left, removing them away from the window and kind of looking at that little kiddo where the yellow arrow is. He's right up in front of the teacher. He's right up in front of the board. We're really minimizing that distraction and putting him right in front in that educational setting, right in front of the board. And then, the example on the right is you can change the light quality. There's many teachers out there that choose a subtle blue light rather than the bright light of a traditional classroom. And the third barrier is making adjustments to the physical layout of the room, where the barrier is physically accessing resources. So there's something in the environment that's keeping a student from being the most engaged or moving around the classroom. So the first one is being closer to an outlet. So if you have a student that uses multiple pieces of technology, maybe the battery drains fast, have them being closer to an outlet where they can stay plugged in and they're not distracted by the battery. That's an option. It's possible that children that have some physical limitations and a physical impairment might need a larger desk to accommodate their wheelchair. That really is a child's preference. I've met some kids that really would prefer to not have a larger desk and they wind up putting things in their lap instead. So make sure, especially as children get older, that you have their buy-in and that you have conversations with them so they can go ahead and advocate for the things that they need in order to make their setting in their classroom more accessible. They also might need more room for equipment depending on the level of physical disability that they have. And they're also going to need to have access to assistive technology. So, and I say this a lot, I'm sure you've heard me say it if you've watched my videos, you've seen me on other platforms. Assistive technology is the missing piece when it comes to having kids be successful in accessing content, accessing their setting, and accessing and engaging in all of their learning. So we want to make sure that when we're providing assistive technology as a resource for a child, that they have access to assistive technology and they're able to utilize all of the different pieces of assistive tech that they need in order to be successful. So here's just some examples. There's an adjustable desk. If you have legs that go up and down on desks in your classroom, there might be the need for some wider aisles. When I talk about flexible spaces, every single student in your classroom, regardless of whether they have a disability or not, should be able to access all the different pieces of your classroom. So aisles should be wide enough. There should be plenty of spaces for kids to move around. And like I said before, we want to make sure that they have access to outlets to plug in devices or medical equipment or whatever else that they might have. So even though that was just 3 kind of basic barriers for setting, there is so much potential and possibility, and accommodations are always implemented and determined based on individual student need. It's never one person's opinion about what they think Marcus needs in the classroom. It's an IEP team decision that is based on data, it's based on observation, it's based on evaluation. All of those things are taken into consideration. So remember, there's lots of possibility, lots of potential, and there's always room on IEPs to be creative and write in some unique accommodations. If you have additional questions after you've watched this video or any of my other videos on accommodations or how-tos when it comes to using assistive technology, I have a parent coaching group called the Empowered Parent. And in this group, we support parents as they support their child in being more engaged and having more access and flexibility in the classroom, really empowering parents to empower their children to be independent and confident learners. And there's also a Facebook group called the Collective for Parents of Children with Disabilities. There you'll find loads of free resources, lots of opportunities for growth, and guest speakers and coaching opportunities there as well. So please shout out with questions. You can reach out to me down below at dj@inclusivology.com, and you can check out more about coaching at inclusivology.com. Thanks so much.